welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Sleeping Beauty and other stories. A story fairer than a fairy. Once upon a time, there was a king who had no children for many years after his marriage. At length, heaven granted him a daughter of such remarkable beauty that he could think of no name so appropriate other than fairer than a fairy. It never occurred to the good-natured monarch that such a name was down to call down the hatred and jealousy of all the fairies on the child, but this is what happened. No sooner had they heard of this presumptuous name that they resolved to gain possession of her who bore it, and either to torment her cruelly, or at least conceal her from the eyes of all men. The eldest of their tribe was entrusted to carry out their revenge. This fairy was named Legree. She was so old that she only had one eye and one tooth left. And even those poor remains she had to keep all night in a strengthening liquid. Ugh. She was so spiteful that she gladly devoted all her time to carry out all the mean or ill-natured tricks of the whole body of fairies. With her large experience added to her native spite, she found but little difficulty in carrying off fairer than a fairy. The poor child, who was only 7 years old, nearly died of fear on finding herself in the power of this hideous creature. However, when after an hour's journey underground, she found herself in a splendid palace with lovely gardens, she felt a little reassured and was further cheered when she discovered that her pet cat and dog had followed her. The old fairy led her into a pretty room, which she should be hers, at the same time giving her the strictest orders never to let go out of the fire which was burning brightly on the grate. She then gave 2 glass bottles into the prince's charge, desiring her to take the greatest care of them, and having enforced her orders with the most awful threats in case of her disobedience. She vanished, leaving the poor little girl at liberty to discover the palace and grounds, and a good deal relieving, and only have 2 apparently easy tasks set to her. Several years passed, during which time the princess grew accustomed to her lonely life, obeying the fairy's orders, and by degree forgot all about the court of the king, her father. One day, while passing out near a fountain in the garden, she noticed that the sun rays fell on the water in such a manner as to produce a brilliant rainbow. She stood still to admire it, when to her great surprise she heard a voice addressing her which seemed to come from the center of its rays. The voice was that of a young man, and its sweetness of tone and agreeable to things it uttered led her to infer that the owner must be equally charming. But this had to be the mere matter of fancy, for no one was visible. The beautiful rainbow informed fairer than a fairy that he was young, the son of a powerful king, and that the fairy Legree, who owed his parents a grudge, had revenged herself by depriving him of his natural shape for some years, that she had imprisoned him to the palace, where he had found his confinement hard to bear for some time now. But now, he owned, he no longer sighed for freedom, since he had seen and learned to love fairer than a fairy. He had many other tender speeches to his declaration, and the princess, to whom such remarks were such a new experience, could not help feeling pleased and touched by his attentions. The prince could only appear or speak under the form of a rainbow, and therefore it was necessary that the sun should shine on water as to enable the rays to inform themselves. Fairer than a fairy lost no moment in which she could meet Prince Rainbow, then enjoyed many long and interesting interviews. One day, however, their conversations became so absorbing and the time passed so quickly that the princess forgot to attend the fire and it went out. Legree, on her return, soon found the neglect and seemed only too pleased to have the opportunity of showing her spite to her lovely prisoner. She ordered fairer than a fairy to start the next day at dawn to ask the Locrinos for fire for which to relight the one she had gone out. Now this Locrinos was a cruel monster who devoured everyone he came across. and especially enjoyed a chance of catching any young girls. Our heroine obeyed with great sweetness, and without having to take the leave of her love, she set off to Locrinos as to a certain death. As she was crossing a wood, a bird said to pick up a shining pebble which she would find in a fountain close by, and use it when needed. She took the bird's advice, and in time arrived at the house of Locrinos. Luckily, she found his wife at home, who was much struck by the princess's youth and beauty and sweet, gentle manners, and still further impressed by the present of the shining pebble. She readily let Fairer than a Fairy have the fire. In return for the stone, she gave another, which she said might prove useful some day. Then she sent her away without doing her any harm. Legree was as much surprised and displeased at the happy result of this expedition, and Fairer than a Fairy waited anxiously for an opportunity of meeting Prince Rainbow and telling him her adventures. She found, however, that he had already been all about them by a fairy who protected them and to whom he was related. The dread of fresh dangers to his beloved princess made him devise some more convenient way of meeting them by the garden and the fountain, and Fairer than a Fairy carried out his plan daily with entire success. Every morning she placed a large basin full of water on her windowsill, and as soon as the rays fell on the water, the rainbow appeared as clearly as it had done on the fountain. By this means they were able to meet without losing sight of the fire, or one of the two bottles in which the old fairy kept her eye and tooth at night. And for some reason, they enjoyed every hour of sunshine together. One day, Prince Rainbow appeared in the depths of woe. He just heard he was about to be banished from this lovely spot, but he had no idea where he was going to go. The poor young couple were in despair, and only part with the last ray of sunshine in hopes of meeting the next morning. Alas, next day was dark and gloomy, and it was only late in the afternoon that the sun broke through the clouds for a few minutes. Fairer than a Fairy eagerly ran to the window, but in her haste she upset the basin and spilt all the water which she had carefully filled it overnight. No other water was in, except that in two bottles. It was only the chance of seeing her love before they were separated that she did not hesitate to break off the bottles and pour their contents into the basin, and the rainbow appeared at once. Their farewells were full of tenderness. The prince made the most ardent and sincere protestations, and appeared to promise neglect nothing which might help to deliver his dear Fairer than a Fairy from captivity, and implored her to consent to their marriage as soon as they should be free. The princess, on her side, vowed to have no other husband, and declared herself willing to brave death itself in order to rejoin him. They were not allowed much time for their goodbyes. The rainbow vanished, and the princess, resolved to run all risks, started off at once, taking nothing with her but her dog, her cat, a sprig of myrtle, and the stone with the wife of Locrinos gave her. When Legree became aware of her prisoner's flight, she was furious, and she set off at full speed in pursuit. She overtook her just as the poor girl, overcome by fatigue, had lain down to rest in a cave which the stone had formed to shelter her. The little dog, who was watching her mistress, promptly flew at Legree and bit her so severely that she stumbled across a corner of the cave and broke off her only tooth. Ew. Before she had recovered from the pain that this rage had caused her, the princess had time to escape, and was somewhere on her road. Fear gave her strength for some time, but at last she could go no further and sank down to rest. As she did so, the sprig of myrtle she carried touched the ground, and immediately a green and shady bower sprang up around her, which she hoped to sleep in peace. But Legree had not given up her pursuit, and arrived just as Fairer than a Fairy had fallen asleep. This time she made sure of catching her victim, but the cat spied her out, and springing from one of the boughs of arbor, she flew at Legree's face and tore out her only eye, thus delivering the princess forever from her persecutor. One might have thought that would now be all be well, but no sooner had Legree been put up the flight than our heroine was overwhelmed by hunger and thirst. She felt as though she should certainly expire. It was with some difficulty that she dragged herself as far as pretty little green and white house, which stood at no greater distance. Here she was received by a beautiful lady dressed in green and white to match the house, which apparently belonged to her, and of which she was the only inhabitant. She greeted the fainting princess most kindly, gave her an excellent supper, and after a long night's rest in delightful bed, told her that many troubles she would finally attain her desire. As the green and white lady took her leave of the princess, she gave her a nut, desiring her only to open it in the most urgent need. After a long and tiring journey, Fairer Than a Fairy was once more received in a house, and by a lady exactly like the one she had quitted. Here again she received a present with the same injunctions, but instead of a nut, this lady gave her a golden pomegranate. The mournful princess had to continue her weary way, and after many troubles and hardships, she found again rest and shelter in a third house exactly like the two others. These houses belonged to three sisters, all endowed with fairy gifts, and also like in mind and person that they wish their houses and garments be equally alike. Their occupation consisted of those in misfortune, and they were gentle and benevolent, as Legree had been cruel and spiteful. The third fairy comforted the poor traveler, begged her not to lose heart, and assured that her trouble should be rewarded. She accompanied her by the gift of a crystal-smelling bottle, with strict orders to open it only in case of urgent need. Fairer Than a Fairy thanked her warmly and resumed her way through the pleasant thoughts. After her time, her road led through a wood full of soft airs and sweet odors. Before she had gotten yard, she saw a wonderful silver castle suspended by strong silver chains to four of the large trees. It was so perfectly hung that a gentle breeze rocked it sufficiently to send you pleasantly to sleep. Fairer Than a Fairy felt a strong desire to enter the castle, but besides it being hung a little above ground, there seemed to be neither doors nor windows. She had no doubt, though she really couldn't think why, that the moment had come to use the nut which had been given to her. She opened it and came out a diminutive hall porter at whose belt hung a tiny cabin, at the end of which was a gold half-key, as the smallest pin you ever saw. The princess climbed up one of the silver trains, holding it in her little hand. The porter, who, in spite of his minute size, opened a secret door with a golden key and let her in. She entered a magnificent room which appeared to occupy the entire castle, which was lighted by gold and jewels and stars in the ceiling. In the midst of this room stood a couch, draped with curtains of all the colors of the rainbow, and suspended by golden cords so that it swayed with the castle in a manner which rocked its occupants fully to sleep. On the elegant couch lay Prince Rainbow, looking more beautiful than ever, and sunk in its powerful slumber in which he had been held ever since his disappearance. Fairer Than a Fairy, who now saw him for the first time in real shape, hardly dared to gaze at him, fearing his appearance might not be keeping in with the voice and language which had won her heart. At the time she could not help feeling rather hurt at the apparent indifference for which she had received. She related all the dangers and difficulties she had gone through, and she repeated the story 20 times in a loud, clear voice. The prince slept on and took no heed. She then had recourse to the golden pomegranate, and on the opening found that all the seeds were little violins which flew up in the vaulted roof, and the ones began playing melodiously. The prince was not completely aroused, but he opened his eyes a little and looked at the handsomer. Imagine not being at all recognized, Fairer Than a Fairy now drew out her third present, and opening the crystal scent bottle, a little siren flew out, who silenced the violin and then sang close to the prince's ear the story of his lady love had suffered in her search for him. She had some gentle reproaches to the castle, but before she had gotten so far, he was wide awake and, transported with joy, threw himself at the princess's feet. At the same moment, the walls of the room expanded and opened out, revealing a golden throne with covered jewels. A magnificent court now began to assemble, and at the time, several elegant carriages filled with ladies in magnificent dresses drove up. In the first and most splendid of these carriages sat Prince Rainbow's mother. She fondly embraced her son, after which she informed him that his father had been dead for some years, that the anger of the fairies was at length appeased, and that he might return in peace to reign over his people, who were longing for his presence. The court received the new king with joyful acclamations, which would have delighted him at any other time, but all his thoughts were full of Fairer Than a Fairy. He was just about to present her to his mother and the court, feeling sure that her triumphs would win all hearts, when the three sisters dressed in green and white appeared. They declared the secret of Fairer Than a Fairy's royal birth, and the queen, taking two lovers in her carriage, set off for them for the capital of the kingdom. Here they were received with tumultuous joy. The wedding was celebrated without delay. In succeeding years diminished not the virtuous beauty, nor the mutual affection of King Rainbow and his queen, Fairer Than a Fairy. And that's the end of that story. See you later.